The winter of 1819 settled over Ashvale Park like a decree. It came not as a single storm, but as an accumulation. Frost laid each night over the gravel drive, ice forming in the low places where the kitchen garden wall cast its longest shadow, snow gathering in the hollow above the south portico where no servant bothered to sweep. The house itself was vast and grey-stoned and old in the particular way of houses that have outlasted their builders, and are no longer entirely certain what they are meant to shelter. 3 wings stretched out from a central hall with the tired confidence of a man who has forgotten what he originally stood to say. The windows were many and large, and most of them dark at any given hour, which gave the exterior the expression of a face with too many eyes, the greater part of them closed. Inside, fires were lit only in rooms in present use, and even those fires were modest, coal rationed not from poverty exactly, but from the habit of economy that had settled over the estate in the 3 years since the Duke had stopped receiving visitors. The corridors held cold the way stone holds cold, not as a temporary condition, but as a natural state of being, a preference rather than a circumstance. The paintings in the long gallery had grown accustomed to it. The furniture in the east drawing-room sat beneath holland covers as patient and still as furniture, waiting for a funeral. Ashvale Park was not decaying, precisely. It was simply not alive. Into this house on the 14th of January in the year 1819 came a carriage hired from Bracknell, carrying 1 trunk, 1 hat box, and 1 woman of 26 years named Eleanor Vane. She was the great-niece of a late countess of something sufficiently remote that the connection required explanation whenever it was raised, and it was rarely raised because Eleanor's circumstances did not invite the close attention of people who might find such connections useful. She was not plain, though she was often described as such by people who did not look at her carefully, and she was not poor, though she occupied that particular stratum of genteel shortage in which one keeps all the habits of comfort, while quietly doing without most of its substance. Her gloves were darned, fine work, careful, and nearly invisible, but darned. Her pelisse was a dove-grey wool that had been let out at the seams and rehemmed so expertly that only someone who knew to look would have noticed, and Eleanor was accustomed to being among those who knew to look. She had been engaged as companion to the household of Edmund Ashvale, the 5th Duke of Ashvale, at a wage of £30 per annum, room and board provided. The position had been communicated through an advertisement in a London journal placed by the Duke's man of business, and Eleanor had answered it, not with desperation, but with the quiet practicality of a woman who has examined her available options and chosen the most honest one. She needed employment. The Duke needed, apparently, some variety of company that was not his mother and not his servants, and since Eleanor Vane possessed both a tolerable education and the temperament required to remain unnoticed in a cold house, she was considered sufficient. The carriage wheels crunched to a stop on the frost-hard gravel. Eleanor descended without waiting for the footman and stood a moment looking at the house. It looked back at her with those many dark windows. Then she saw at one of the upper windows of the central block the outline of a figure, still, upright. Not quite at the glass, but close enough to be visible. She could not make out the face. The figure did not move. She picked up her hat-box and walked toward the entrance, and when she reached the top step and turned to glance upward, the window was already empty. Croft, the housekeeper, received her in the entrance hall with the economy of warmth appropriate to a house where warmth was rationed, a compact woman of middle years with a grey dress and an expression of permanent assessment. She conducted Eleanor to her chamber in the east wing without ceremony and without small talk, which Eleanor did not mind. The room was adequately furnished and very cold. On the table beside the narrow bed, someone had placed a single candle stub in a brass holder. On the chair beside the wardrobe sat a pair of grey woolen gloves, not hers, somewhat newer than the pair she wore. No note explained them. Eleanor unpacked her trunk with the methodical calm of someone who has unpacked in uncertain circumstances before. And, when she had finished, she stood at the window and looked out at the frozen kitchen garden below, and the bare trees beyond it and the grey sky above those. And she told herself, in the quiet way she told herself most important things, that she would manage here. She would be useful. She would not complain about the cold. She had been at Ashvale 4 days before the letter appeared. It arrived not by post and not by hand delivery in the usual sense. It was simply there in the gap beneath the door of her chamber when she rose before first light on the 5th morning, lying on the bare floorboards, in the way that things left without ceremony always lie, as though they have been waiting without patience and without impatience alike. A folded sheet of heavy cream paper, sealed with plain wax, pressed to no particular shape. Her name written on the outside in a hand she did not yet recognize. Economical, precise, each letter properly formed and no more, as though the writer had considered every pen stroke before committing it, and found no reason to embellish. She broke the seal and read by the light of her stub candle. The instruction was brief. She was to present herself to the library on the ground floor of the West Wing each morning between first light and 9 o'clock, for the purpose of cataloguing the volumes therein according to subject and date of acquisition, cross-referenced with an inventory list that would be found on the writing table inside. The note said, with a formal simplicity she found she did not dislike, "This work is presently in a state of neglect, and I would be grateful if you would undertake it." There was no signature. There did not need to be one. Eleanor dressed in the grey morning light, put on her better day dress, the slate-coloured wool she saved for occasions requiring formality, and descended to the West Wing with the note still in her hand, as though she might need to produce it as evidence of her right to be there, which she recognized as an anxious thought and noted without acting on it. The library was at the end of a long corridor that smelled of old paper and cold air, and very faintly of the beeswax that someone had some time ago applied to the panelling on the walls, a task that had not been repeated recently enough to prevent the dust from settling back over the surfaces in an even, fine grey layer. The door was heavy oak, iron-handled, and it opened with the slow deliberation of a door accustomed to silence. Inside, shelves from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, interrupted only by a single tall window facing north and by the chimney-piece on the east wall, where a fire had been laid, the kindling arranged and the coal set ready, but not lit. The writing table the note had mentioned stood at the centre of the room, and on it lay a leather-bound inventory ledger of some considerable age, its pages brown at the edges, the entries made in 4 or 5 different hands over what appeared to be the better part of a century. Alongside it lay a fresh quill and a new bottle of ink, both placed there recently, she judged, by the fact that neither had gathered the fine grey dust coating every other horizontal surface in the room. She stood for a moment in the cold of the library and looked at the shelves. Thousands of volumes, their spines pressed close together like the shoulders of people in a crowd who have been standing there long enough to grow accustomed to the proximity. She walked the perimeter, trailing a finger not quite touching the leather, reading the titles by the dim light of the north window. Here was philosophy in Latin and in English, here natural history, Here sermons in considerable numbers, here poetry from the previous 2 centuries interleaved with agricultural management, here travel narratives from places she had never heard of, and a few she had. She opened volumes at random as she went, turning the pages without reading, and found in almost every one the same careful marginalia. Small pencilled notes in the precise economical hand she now knew from her morning letter. Sometimes a single word queried, sometimes a cross-reference to another volume, sometimes a line quietly underlined with nothing beside it but the underlining itself. Whoever had annotated these books had read them all, not as a performance of learning, but as an act of genuine attention, the kind of attention that leaves traces without intending to. She returned to the writing table, opened the inventory ledger, found the last entry dated 3 years prior, and began. She worked steadily for the better part of 2 hours, moving along the shelves with the systematic patience she applied to any task worth doing. When her hands grew too cold to hold the quill properly, she set it down and looked at the unlit fire and considered it for a moment. She was not, strictly speaking, a housemaid. There would be a boot boy for fires, presumably, though she had not seen one in this wing, and it was well past the hour when the fire ought to have been tended if anyone was expected to work in this room. There was a tinder box on the mantel-shelf. The kindling was already laid. She crossed the room, struck the flint, and the fire caught on the second try with a small, grateful sound. She fed it carefully with 2 pieces of coal from the scuttle and returned to the writing table with her fingers restored to working order, settled herself once more in the chair, and continued the catalogue. She did not know whether she was observed. The library door had been ajar when she arrived, and she had left it so because closing it behind her felt, in a room she had not been invited into by word of mouth, presumptuous. She did not look toward it. She simply continued her work, and the fire she had built from nothing grew steadily warmer behind her, and the room became a fraction less cold, and the day began. It was on the 3rd morning of the catalogue that she found the book. It had been placed on the writing table during the night. She was certain it had not been there when she left the previous afternoon, because she remembered tidying the surface before she went up. The ledger closed and squared precisely with the table edge, the quill set across the neck of the ink bottle, the space otherwise clear and exact in the manner she preferred to leave any surface she had been working on. Now there was a volume, slim and cloth-bound in faded green, lying open to a particular page, its spine held flat by the slight spread of a bookmark made from a strip of folded paper. She looked at it before she touched it. The cover, when she turned it to read the title on the spine, proved to be a collection of philosophical essays on grief and its variations, not a fashionable volume, not the sort of title one would encounter at a London lending library or hear discussed at an evening party with any expectation of agreement. The page to which it had been opened contained a passage of perhaps 200 words on a particular variety of grief, the kind that does not arrive immediately in the days following a death, but delays its coming, settling in months or even years afterward, when the mourner has grown perhaps incautious in the belief that the worst of it has concluded and the remainder of living can resume its previous shape. Eleanor read the passage twice. She was a thorough reader and did not skim even when her intention was simply to take the measure of a thing. She set it aside, reached for the inventory ledger, and was adjusting her chair when she became aware that the doorway was no longer empty. He had not made a sound entering. She did not hear the door move or the floorboards yield beneath his weight or any alteration in the quality of the air in the room that ordinarily precedes the awareness of another person. He was simply present in the doorway when she looked, a tall figure in dark morning clothes, standing with his hands loose at his sides, not quite inside the room and not quite outside it, occupying the threshold with the particular quality of a man who has grown accustomed to the threshold as a position. She had seen him only once before, at a distance, across the entrance hall on the evening of her arrival, and that briefly, in poor light. A broad-shouldered man with dark hair going grey at the temples, a face that had been formed for some expression other than the one it currently wore, which was the expression of someone who has long since ceased to make demands of the world and expects the same courtesy in return. He was perhaps 38 or somewhat past 40. She could not determine it precisely. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back. She did not immediately lower her eyes or compose herself into the posture of deference that the situation and the disparity of their stations might reasonably have suggested, not because she intended any impudence, but because his gaze was direct, and it seemed simply discourteous to answer directness with evasion. They regarded each other across the cold library with the particular quality of attention that belongs to two people who are each accustomed to not being looked at and have not entirely recalled what is to be done when it happens. Then he spoke. His voice was low and rather careful, as though he chose words with the same deliberation she had observed in his marginalia. He said, "Did she find the library cold?" It was framed as a question, lightly, with the inflection of something intended to pass as ordinary. She considered her answer as she would have considered any honest question put to her, not perfunctorily, not with social grace, but genuinely, working through the material of the question before she spoke. She said, yes, she found it cold, particularly in the north corner near the window, before the fire had been lit for an hour or so, at which point the chill diminished to something quite tolerable, and she had found the turkey rug useful, once she had thought to unroll it and position it under the writing table. He listened to this answer with the attention of a man who is not accustomed to being given complete, considered sentences in response to his questions. He did not nod or smile or make any gesture of acknowledgement. He simply attended to what she had said, in the manner of someone receiving information that he intends to make use of and does not need to perform gratitude for. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, unhurried, without farewell or preamble, the corridor absorbing the sound of his footsteps within a few seconds, until there was only the fire and the north light and the shelves and her again. Eleanor returned to the inventory ledger. She did not look toward the door. When she arrived the following morning, she found that a second coal scuttle had been placed beside the hearth, full, and that the turkey rug she had already unrolled had been supplemented with a second one, folded, leaned against the writing table leg. She placed it under the table beside the first. The library was already somewhat warmer than it had been on any previous morning, and she spent a moment standing in front of the fire before she sat, which was not a thing she had permitted herself before that day. The Dowager Duchess Sylvia arrived on the 3rd Wednesday of January in a carriage that announced itself from some considerable distance, large, ducal black, somewhat old-fashioned in its appointments, with the kind of iron-shod momentum that belongs to conveyances driven by coachmen who have been told to make good time and have taken the instruction personally. It came up the drive with the air of a thing that has a perfect right to be wherever it finds itself and does not require the drive's permission. The Dowager descended from it with the economy of movement that belongs to those who have long since stopped performing ease and arrived instead at something beyond it, authority worn so thoroughly into the body that it no longer requires expression. She was perhaps 60, or somewhat more, with a face of regular and handsome severity, hair dressed in a style that had been correct a decade prior, and would remain so through force of will alone. She wore deep purple, not mourning exactly, but a colour that reminded those in her vicinity of her connection to loss, and of her superior familiarity with it, as though she had made grief's acquaintance first, and possessed certain proprietary rights over how it was to be understood. She had not, Eleanor gathered from Mrs. Croft's compressed lips, and the speed with which footmen cleared the entrance hall, been expected. The first Eleanor knew of her presence was when a maid appeared at the library door at 8:30, to convey that her Grace wished Miss Vane to attend her in the morning room at 10 o'clock. Eleanor closed the inventory ledger, adjusted her dress, the good one, since the occasion clearly required it, and went. The morning room was the warmest chamber in the east wing, a fact that suggested the dowager's domestic arrangements had preceded her own arrival by some hours. She sat beside the fire in a chair of considerable upholstery, and appraised Eleanor as she entered with the frank, comprehensive attention of someone accustomed to forming opinions on livestock at a distance, bringing that same objective thoroughness to the examination of anything she considered it useful to have accurately assessed. Tea had been laid. Better tea than any Eleanor had been offered in her 4 days at Ashvale, which suggested the dowager had brought her own supply. Eleanor was not invited to sit immediately. She stood for what she judged to be a full minute under this scrutiny, before the dowager gestured at the chair opposite with one ringed hand and said, "Sit down." Eleanor sat. She was served tea. The conversation that followed was conducted in the form of a series of statements with which Eleanor was expected to agree, interspersed with questions that were not questions in any real sense but categorizations, instruments of measurement employed by a woman who had spent 60 years sorting people into their proper classifications and could do so with the efficiency of long practice. The dowager established that Eleanor's income was £30 per annum. She established that Eleanor's people had been in Somerset, more or less, or had been at one time, and that there was no father currently alive and no mother to speak of, and that the connection to the late Countess was not close enough to be considered of social consequence by anyone paying attention. She established, with a precision that was almost admirable in its directness, that Eleanor had not been educated at a school of any particular note, and that she had no prospects currently underway that might cause this engagement to be foreshortened. She established these things not because she was interested in the answers, but because she wished Eleanor to understand that she had them, and that having them meant that Eleanor was exactly as situated as the dowager had assumed before she entered the room, and the assumption had not needed revising. Then the dowager set down her cup. She said her son was expected to offer for Lady Cecily Marsh before the summer. The family seat was in Wiltshire, 6,000 acres, an income to match, and Lady Cecily was considered quite beautiful by those who concerned themselves with such assessments. There would be an engagement announced at the county assembly in March, should everything proceed as it ought, as the dowager fully expected it would. She said all of this with the pleasant certainty of someone who has arranged a considerable number of outcomes and found that arrangements, when properly made, tend to hold. Eleanor absorbed this information. She did not look away, did not shift in her chair, did not allow the small tightening at her collarbone, a physical response she noted without approving, to reach her face. She folded her hands in her lap over the smooth grey wool of her skirt, and she met the dowager's gaze with the same quality of direct attention she had given the Duke in the library 2 days prior, except that this time she understood precisely what was being sought, the flinch, the colour in the cheek, the slight alteration of posture that would confirm the dowager had reached something and could therefore confirm that there was something to be reached. Eleanor gave her instead the calm, unhurried face of a woman who has been told things intended to diminish her before, and has learned that the diminishment is accomplished only with one's own assistance. The dowager said, after a moment, she hoped they understood each other. Eleanor said that she believed they did. She finished her tea, thanked the dowager for her time, and was shown out. In the east corridor, walking at her ordinary pace with no one watching, she looked down at her hands. The darned gloves, grey silk thread on grey wool, the mends so fine as to be nearly invisible. She had done that mending herself at a kitchen table in Bath 2 years ago, with thread bought for 4pence at a haberdashery on Milsom Street. They were very good gloves still. The mending had held perfectly, and there was plenty of wear left in them. There was a walled kitchen garden on the south side of the house, sheltered on 3 sides by old brick that held a little warmth even in January, and on the 4th by a hornbeam hedge grown tall and dense over the course of the previous century until it constituted a wall of its own, bare-branched now but close-woven enough still to break the wind that came down from the north fields across the frozen park. Inside that enclosure the world was, if not warm, at least less cold than everywhere else at Ashvale, which made it the one outdoor place that could be walked with some degree of comfort during the winter months, the one place where the cold had been persuaded to become merely incidental rather than the whole character of the air. Eleanor had discovered it on her second day, following a path from the servants' entrance through an iron gate hung crookedly on a stone pillar whose mortar had been giving way for some years. And she had made a quiet habit of it, in the mornings before the library work began, and in the early afternoons when the work was done and her presence was not required elsewhere, which was most of the time. The afternoons at Ashvale had no prescribed structure for her, and she had learned to inhabit them with the same practical attention she brought to everything, not filling the hours uselessly, but not wasting them either, spending them in the garden when the weather permitted, and in her room with a book when it did not. She walked it again on the Friday afternoon of the second week of her engagement, having escaped the East Wing, where the Dowager Duchess was still in residence, the rooms growing perceptibly smaller by the hour under the accumulated force of her opinions on how a great house ought properly to be managed. It was perhaps 2:30, and the light was already beginning its early winter retreat, turning from the pale white of midday to the amber grey of late afternoon. She passed through the iron gate and followed the gravel path inside the wall, her breath making small pale shapes in the still air, her boots crunching over the frost-killed grass at the path's edge where the gravel thinned. She had nearly completed the first circuit of the garden when she became aware that someone was already there. He stood in the southwest corner, where a single rosebush grew in a bed that had been kept clear of weeds and well mulched even through the dormant season. The soil turned and dressed with evident care, while the beds around it had been left to go rough and frostbitten, as though the care had been deliberately concentrated in one place. He had a pair of pruning shears in his gloved hand, and was working at the canes of the rosebush with the focused, unhurried attention of someone doing a thing they have done many times, and still find worthy of the same attention each time. Eleanor slowed, but did not turn back. To turn back would have been to make her presence into a retreat, and she had come for the quiet liberty of the garden and did not intend to surrender it without necessity. She walked her ordinary pace along the gravel, and he heard her, lifted his head, nodded once with the brevity of a man who has decided a nod is sufficient communication, and returned to the rosebush. When she came round to the southwest corner again, he was still there, working more slowly now, examining the canes with the deliberateness of someone deciding what the structure requires and what must be let go. She slowed. She looked at the rosebush. It was a climbing rose of some considerable age, the canes thick and grey-barked, the thorns long and serious, the whole thing cut back hard. 2 years of growth at least reduced to the strongest and most essential framework, the kind of pruning that looks severe to the uninformed eye and is simply honest to anyone who understands what roses need to survive and eventually to bloom. She said, without particular intention, simply because the observation was present and it would have been strange not to speak. "It is very old," he said, without looking up immediately. 112 years, by the records of the kitchen garden. The 5 previous Duchesses of Ashvale had each tended it in their time, one after another, as though it were a common inheritance passed between them. And the 6th, here, he paused only barely enough to mark the pause as distinct from the rhythm of speech, had loved it especially. He turned the shears in his hands, examining the blade against the pale sky with the incidental attention of a man who is not entirely speaking to another person, but has not yet decided to stop. She planted it herself, he said, from a cutting taken from her family's garden in Kent when she first came here. Eleanor was quiet. She understood that she was being given something and that what was being given required from her no response of the ordinary consoling kind, no reassurance, no graceful acknowledgement, no management of the feeling that had produced the words. She offered none of those things. After a pause that had the quality of air left to settle, she said only, "It will bloom again in May." She said it simply, in the tone she used for horticultural fact, because it was one. He looked at her then, fully, directly, with the rosebush and its patient bare canes at his side and nothing else between them. The expression she could not have named precisely, the habitual reserve, yes, but behind it, something that looked very much like surprise at the manner of saying, rather than the content, as though it had simply not occurred to him that a person might speak to a painful thing plainly and without managing the one who mentioned it. They stood together in the southwest corner for a minute or perhaps 2, in a silence that had become, without announcing the transition, a companionable one. Then the light changed another degree toward evening and they both turned, separately, back toward the house. Lady Cecily Marsh arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of February, attended by her mother, 2 personal maids, 3 trunks of considerable size, and a wolfhound of unusual dimensions that immediately claimed the largest hearthrug in the entrance hall and could not thereafter be persuaded from it by any means available to the Ashvale footman. She was, Eleanor observed with the honest accuracy she applied to everything, very beautiful. Not in the complicated, interesting way that requires study and rewards the second and third examination, in the clear, immediate way that makes a room gather itself the moment a person enters it, the way beauty functions as its own kind of social event, requiring nothing further of the person who possesses it except the trouble of arriving. Her hair was the dark gold of expensive honey. Her complexion was the kind written about in sonnets and approvingly described in private letters between mothers of eligible sons. She moved through rooms as though they had been arranged specifically for her convenience, and she was not vain about this. She simply did not notice the arrangement because she had never in her life stood in a room arranged for someone else, and had never been required to consider what that other arrangement might feel like, she greeted Edmund in the entrance hall with the warmth of someone who has been told to be warm and has genuinely attempted the instruction, and Edmund received this greeting with the formal, correct attentiveness of a man fulfilling an obligation he has agreed to, without enthusiasm and without dishonesty. He was not performing engagement he did not feel. He was simply supplying the exterior of engagement, which was a different thing, and perhaps, Eleanor thought, a kinder one. She observed this from the far end of the entrance hall, where she had been passing with a stack of ledger folios. No one introduced them. She was not surprised. The days that followed took on the quality of a performance, in which the principal actors had been given their parts, the supporting characters had been given their positions, and the audience, those members of the household who had enough context to understand what they were watching, knew the arc and was simply waiting for the machinery of the plot to advance to its next position. The Dowager presided over meals and parlour evenings and an excursion to the church at Ashvale village with the satisfaction of a woman watching a careful plan execute itself without interference. Lady Cecily was easy company. Genuinely so, Eleanor observed, with the fairness she tried to apply to assessments of people she had reason to look at with less than perfect charity. She chatted about the London season and the houses she had visited and the assemblies she had found amusing with the natural fluency of someone who has had many pleasant things happen to them and has assumed, on the available evidence, that this will continue. She was not cruel. She was not calculating. She was simply moving through a world that had been organised around her comfort for the whole of her 22 years, and had not yet had occasion to notice what the periphery of that world contained. Edmund was present at these conversations in body and in the technical sense of social participation. He spoke when spoken to, answered questions with adequate completeness, offered the forms of interest that a correctly raised man of his position knew to supply. But Eleanor, who had been watching him for 3 weeks with the quiet, consistent attention she gave anything she found worth studying, saw that he was not present in any more real sense than the holland-covered chairs in the east drawing-room. He was somewhere behind the performance of courtesy, somewhere quite far back, in a room she could not see into from where she sat. Where she sat, on the 2 parlour evenings the Dowager arranged, was outside the prescribed grouping. The Dowager had, with the naturalness of a woman who has arranged rooms all her life, placed herself, Edmund and Lady Cecily and her mother in the inner ring near the fire, leaving the outer chairs for those whose presence was useful but peripheral. Eleanor had a chair near the window on the second evening, which was cold, and a small table for embroidery, and she worked the grey linen ground with a discipline that had more to do with having something to occupy her hands than with any interest in the pattern. She was not performing industry. She was simply using it in the way one uses a tool that comes to hand. It was during the second parlour evening near 9 o'clock, with the Dowager's conversation filling the air between the inner chairs, that she felt, without any particular cause she could identify, a gaze on her. She looked up from the embroidery. Edmund was looking at her from across the room, not for long, a moment, perhaps less than a moment in the way that certain moments are shorter than others while containing more. His expression was the habitual, composed reserve, unchanged from everything else about him. But he was looking at her, deliberately and directly, not in the direction of Lady Cecily, to whom he had been attending, not at the fire or the window, but across the room to where Eleanor sat, with her embroidery in her lap, and her chair drawn a little toward the cold window glass. She held his gaze for exactly the time it took to register it. Then she looked away, back to the embroidery, back to the small, neat stitches in the grey ground, and she did not look up again for the remainder of the evening, and she told herself this was appropriate, and she mostly believed it. Lady Cecily departed on the Saturday morning with her mother, her maids, her trunks, and the wolfhound, and the house exhaled. Eleanor felt it plainly, without embarrassment at the plainness of the feeling. The quality of the air changed within an hour of the carriage, leaving the drive, the rooms recovering their own character rather than functioning as a backdrop to something external, the cold settling back into its impersonal natural silence rather than the enforced, performing kind that had been required of the house all week. She spent the afternoon in the library and the next 2 mornings there as well, working through the philosophy section with a methodical pleasure she had not entirely realized she had missed until she found it again. The library had become, over the past 3 weeks, one of those rare places in which she felt consistently herself, not positioned in relation to other people's requirements of her, not assessed or placed, simply present with the work and the books and the fire she lit each morning, and the north window light and the faint, familiar smell of beeswax in the old panelling. She was cataloguing a shelf of mid-century moral philosophy on the Tuesday of the following week when she noticed the gap. A slim volume was absent from its position between 2 larger ones, leaving a space of approximately the right width. She checked the spines of the volumes on either side. These were in her inventory, positions noted and recorded, and felt the absence with the instinct of someone who has been reading a space daily and registers its disturbance before she can articulate why. She searched the nearby shelves carefully. She checked the writing table and the chair beside the fire. Then she found it on the shelf beside the door, precisely replaced, its spine flush with its neighbours, as though it had always been there and the question of it having been elsewhere had simply not arisen. Her own copy of a collection of pastoral essays she had carried from Somerset in the bottom of her trunk. She had brought it as one brings things one returns to, quietly, without announcement, because it was hers and she trusted it. She had not lent it to anyone at Ashvale and had not, in fact, seen it since she unpacked on the evening of her arrival. She took it down and opened it. She turned through the pages slowly, with the attention one gives to a familiar book held in unfamiliar circumstances, her name on the inside cover in her own hand, her occasional penciled marks beside passages she had revisited over the years, and toward the back, on the final page, just below the last printed line of text, a single addition in pencil in the precise economical hand she had by now come to know as well as a voice heard daily in an adjacent room. You see things steadily. Nothing more. No initial, no date, no elaboration. She stood with the book open and read the line again, and then once more, and then she simply stood with it. For a time she did not measure, aware of the fire behind her and the north window light and the complete stillness of the room, and the particular weight of the slim volume in her hands. She had been told things about herself over the course of her life, things said approvingly, and things said otherwise, and she had catalogued them with the same honest attention she brought to everything, accepting the ones that seemed accurate, and setting aside the ones that seemed designed to serve the speaker rather than to describe her. This was accurate. It was also, she thought, the first thing anyone had said to her at Ashvale that addressed her, rather than her situation, her usefulness, or her connections. She carried the book to the chair beside the writing table, the adjacent chair, the one she used for reading rather than for work, and she sat with it closed in her lap, her thumb resting on the spine, and she did not catalogue and did not read, and did not do anything at all for some time, which was unusual for her and which she permitted without apology. That evening, near 8 o'clock, she was in the library sorting the completed inventory cards into order for the following morning, when the door opened and Edmund came in. He did not knock. It was his library, and he offered no explanation for his arrival. He took a volume from the shelf near the door without hesitation, with the ease of someone who knows exactly where a particular book lives and does not need to consider the question, and carried it to the chair on the far side of the hearth from hers and sat. He opened the book. She returned to the inventory. Neither of them spoke. The fire burned between them, with the steadiness of a fire that has found its level and does not require attention. The room was entirely quiet except for the occasional small sound of a page turned and the soft, intermittent shift of coal settling in the grate. They remained so for the better part of an hour. Eleanor thought afterward, when the fire had gone fully to coals and she had risen to go up for the night, that it had been the most comfortable she had felt since the 14th of January. A thing she examined from several angles before she allowed herself to simply let it be so. It happened on a Thursday in the second week of February, on a morning that had given no particular sign of what it intended. Eleanor had been in the library until nearly noon, working her way through the final shelf of the natural history section, and had returned to her room to wash the dust from her hands before going down to the midday meal. She was at the washstand when she heard a step in the corridor that did not belong to any maid, too heavy, too deliberate, and then not a knock but simply the door opening, and the Dowager Duchess was inside the room before Eleanor had turned from the basin. She stood in the centre of the chamber in her deep purple wool, with her cane in her hand, and she said, with the directness of someone who has been waiting for this moment and has decided not to warm to it gradually, "I have seen your letter." There was only one letter Eleanor had written in her time at Ashvale. She had composed it over 2 evenings the previous week, a letter to her cousin Augusta Vane in London, her nearest living relation, a woman of moderate means and considerable warmth, who wrote to Eleanor faithfully once a month and deserved in return something more considered than a brief note. It was an ordinary letter. It described the house and the quality of the cold and the library work and the sound the frost made on the stone of the east wing at 4 in the morning, and the rosebush in the kitchen garden, and the particular quality of the beeswax used for the long corridor. These observations, rendered with the precise sensory attention that Eleanor's letters always had, because it had been her habit since girlhood to write what she actually noticed rather than what she thought was expected. It mentioned nothing of the Duke, or of the Dowager, or of Lady Cecily. It asked after Augusta's health and her daughter's progress at the pianoforte, and it enclosed a pressed sprig of something from the kitchen garden she had found between 2 pavers, a small token of the kind that amused them both. The letter had been placed, as she always placed letters for posting, on the hall table in the east corridor on the Monday morning. Eleanor looked at the Dowager's expression and understood, with the clarity that comes from having been in a sufficient number of rooms with people who have decided to misrepresent something, that the letter had been read, and that it would be described back to her in a form tailored to a purpose rather than to the truth. She said, with a composure she kept very deliberate and very even, she wondered what the letter had contained in the Dowager's reading. The Dowager said it contained evidence of a design, a communication intended to establish interest in matters beyond the scope of her engagement, a letter calculated, in short, to secure for herself a better placement than she currently occupied by communicating the details of the household to parties in London who might find that information of use. Eleanor received this without expression. She did not argue. She did not explain. She excused herself from the room, went to her writing case and retrieved the duplicate she always made of any letter to Augusta, a habit formed in childhood when letters went astray not infrequently, and the second copy had more than once been the only remaining evidence of what had actually been said. She went downstairs and found Edmund in the portrait gallery. He was standing before a full-length painting in the middle of the south wall, a man in the court dress of 50 years prior, with a face that bore certain structural similarities to his own. The same bones, the same quality of contained composure, and his posture, as she entered at the far end of the gallery, was that of a man who has been told something and is standing with it, deciding what weight to give it. He turned before she spoke. His expression was the reserve she knew, but altered, as though the usual proportions of it had been adjusted, tighter at the edges, narrowed in its focus, carrying something that was not anger, precisely, but occupied the same territory. He said, with a flatness that made it clear he was presenting a summary rather than a question, "You have been writing to London about the household." Eleanor walked the length of the gallery. The portraits of the previous dukes looked down from their gold frames on either side, 4 generations of composed masculine authority, none of them apparently troubled by anything they had encountered. She stopped before Edmund and held out the letter, the duplicate, still folded as it had been when she sealed it. He looked at it in her extended hand without taking it immediately, with the quality of someone who has been braced for a particular kind of response and is recalibrating in the face of one he had not anticipated. Then he took it. He opened it. She stood beside him and was quite still while he read. The portrait gallery was very cold and long, and the light from the tall windows fell on his hands and the pages of her letter with an equal, impersonal clarity. She did not look at the portraits. She looked at his face while he read, at the slight, barely perceptible movement of his eyes, at the stillness of his jaw, at the quality of attention he gave the pages, which was thorough and did not hurry. He read to the end. He stood for some time with the letter in his hand, looking not at Eleanor, but at the portrait of his father, the one that faced him from the south wall, the one he had been standing before when she entered, and his expression had in it the particular quality of a man who has been in the wrong and is not accustomed to finding himself there, and is not certain he knows how to occupy the position with any grace. Between them, and the portrait above them, and the cold air of the gallery, the silence sat with its full, considerable weight. He came to the library the next morning before she had been at work an hour. She heard his footstep in the west corridor before the door opened. She knew it now, as one learns the particular rhythm and weight of the steps of people one shares a house with over time, the way each person has a cadence as individual as a voice heard daily in an adjacent room. And she set down the quill and straightened the inventory ledger on the table before her, and sat with her hands in her lap, which was not how she usually sat when working, and she was aware that sitting that way communicated something about her state of mind that she did not entirely wish to communicate, but also did not know how to correct without making the correction more conspicuous than the thing it was meant to conceal. She had slept with some difficulty the previous night, turning over the portrait gallery in her mind, not with hurt exactly, or not primarily, but with the particular discomfort of a scene that had not resolved itself into any clean understanding before she had been required to leave it. She did not know what he had thought reading the letter. She did not know what the reading had produced, or whether it had produced anything at all, or whether she would be expected to simply carry on as before, with the accumulated weight of the accusation dissolved into the ordinary air of the house. He came in. He stood near the door, as he had on the first morning she had seen him in this room, with that same quality of occupying the threshold, except that on the first morning his stillness had been the habitual, practised stillness of a man who has forgotten how to be in a room with another person, and on this morning it was something more effortful, more consciously maintained, a man who knows what he needs to say and is arranging the sentences before he begins, because the sentences matter, and they must come out correctly and without the qualifications that would diminish them. He said he owed her an apology, and he was sorry, and he should not have listened to what was told to him without first speaking to her directly, and with the fairness that was owed to her as a member of his household. He said it plainly and in full, without qualifying the apology or appending conditions to it, or suggesting that the circumstances had made his response understandable, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated any of those additions, because the additions would have been for his benefit rather than hers. She said nothing. He seemed to have expected this, or to have been prepared for it. After a moment he said he supposed she must find the household rather peculiar. She considered the question honestly, as she considered every question. She said she found it very quiet for the most part. He said, yes. And then, because they were standing in the library they had occupied separately and now together for a little over 5 weeks, with the inventory and the annotated shelves and the fire she built each morning between them and around them, and because the letter had apparently unlocked something that the preceding weeks of careful, measured distance had held firmly closed, he began to speak, not in the manner of a man making a confession, not with any of the formal gravity that confession requires, more in the way of a man who has carried something for so long that he has ceased to fully register the carrying, and is surprised when someone lifts one corner of the weight by how much it has been asking of him all along. He told her about his first marriage, not everything. She had no expectation of everything, and would not have wished for it. The outline of it, arranged between 2 families on grounds of practical advantage, conducted with correctness on both sides, and with genuine courtesy throughout, and never having managed to arrive at anything beyond correctness and courtesy before the illness came in the autumn of their 4th year together. She had been 29. He had been 32, and he had not known. Here he chose each word deliberately, in the careful manner of someone discovering the vocabulary for a thing as he goes. He had not known before she died whether ease between 2 people was something that simply arrived if you waited long enough and maintained the proper forms, or whether it was something one had to produce by some specific act of will, some decision to be more present with another person than habit allowed. He had intended to find out. Then the illness gave no time for finding out, and the question had stayed open for 3 years. He said, with a wry quietness that was the nearest thing to lightness she had heard from him. He had not known that one was simply permitted to talk to a person, that it was allowed as a thing in itself without requiring a particular occasion or a specific reason to justify the taking up of another person's time. Eleanor looked at him across the library. He looked at her. The fire behind them had burned very low without either of them having noticed. She had not added coal, and neither had he, and the coals were orange and settled and very near to going out. She would add more in a moment. The room was warm enough still, and she was not yet ready to move. On a Friday morning in the 3rd week of February, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, Eleanor was summoned to the Dowager Duchess's sitting room on the upper floor of the West Wing. She had known this was coming, not because she had any particular intelligence of it, but because she understood the grammar of the situation with the same logical clarity she applied to any bounded problem. The Dowager had made a move, which had failed, and the moves remaining to her were escalation or withdrawal, and the Dowager was not, as Eleanor had established within 30 minutes of their first interview, a woman who withdrew. The sitting room was the warmest in the West Wing and also the most furnished in the Dowager's particular way, which was the way of a woman who has lived in good houses all her life and expects the rooms she occupies to reflect that fact. A good fire, 2 upholstered chairs, a Persian rug in excellent condition, a writing desk positioned at the window to catch the morning light, a small table with good tea laid for one. On the corner of the writing desk, anchored by a small porcelain dog of the kind one finds on the mantelpieces of houses owned by people who do not themselves purchase porcelain, sat a stack of banknotes. Eleanor looked at them when she entered the room, as one is compelled to look at anything deliberately placed in a prominent position by someone with sufficient confidence to have placed it there deliberately. And then she looked away with the same absence of expression she had given the Dowager's initial appraisal, which had been her most reliable manner in this house, and which she found she had less and less need to manufacture, and more cause simply to allow. The Dowager sat in the larger of the 2 chairs. She did not invite Eleanor to sit, she said. She was prepared to offer 50 guineas for Miss Vane's prompt and quiet departure from Ashvale, sufficient, she judged, to cover the coach fare to Somerset, and 2 months' comfortable lodging in reasonable circumstances while alternative arrangements presented themselves. She said it with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman who has made similar offers before and found money in sufficient quantities to be a reliable solvent of most social inconveniences. Eleanor stood with her hands folded before her and thought about the 50 guineas for precisely as long as a woman who has managed her own finances entirely alone for 4 years requires to understand what 50 guineas means in practical terms. It was a very great deal of money. It was more than she had been offered at one time in her life before, by some considerable margin. She was aware of all of this in full, without sentiment. She said she was grateful for the Dowager's consideration of her circumstances, but she would decline, as she had been engaged by the Duke of Ashvale, and was in consequence accountable to him for the continuation or conclusion of her employment, and the matter did not belong to any other authority. She said it without heat, in the same even tone in which she said things she had concluded about rather than things she was defending under pressure, which was the tone she preferred, because it was the accurate one. The Dowager's expression did not change. She said she trusted Miss Vane understood that a recommendation from this household, or the notable absence of one, would weigh heavily in any future engagement she might seek, and that a woman of her situation could not easily afford to be at odds with people of consequence. Eleanor considered this statement for a moment. She said that was possible. She also considered, she said, that a reputation formed on no actual foundation was a somewhat uncertain instrument of harm, and that in her experience such things tended to reflect more reliably on their source than on their intended object. She said it in the same measured tone in which she said everything else, not as a provocation. It was not a provocation. It was an honest assessment. But as a conclusion she had reached and found no particular reason to soften in the delivery. The dowager looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating an estimate. The adjustment, as near as Eleanor could read it, appeared to be upward. Then the door from the corridor opened. Edmund stood in the doorway. He had not knocked. He looked at the room, his mother in her chair, Eleanor standing, the banknotes in the corner of the desk, the arrangement of the whole scene with its various components in their assigned positions, and his expression moved through something brief and clarifying, like a change in the quality of light, and then settled into the particular stillness she had seen in him only occasionally, when a thing had resolved itself in him, and the resolution was complete. He looked at his mother, he said, in a tone that was entirely without drama, without emphasis, without any element of performance. He understood that she had been offering Miss Vane 50 guineas from the West Wing writing desk. The dowager said that she was conducting a private conversation. He said that he was aware of this, and that the conversation was now finished. He said it in the same tone in which he gave any household instruction that admitted no discussion. The tone, Eleanor thought, of a man who has finally located the boundary of a thing and is standing on the correct side of it, without apology and without excess. He said, Miss Vane's position at Ashvale was not a matter for any authority but his own, and it would remain so. The dowager regarded her son for a long moment. He regarded her. There was a great deal of history in the exchange, 40 years of it at minimum, compressed into 20 seconds of mutual attention. At the conclusion of it, the dowager reached for her cup, set it down with the small, precise sound she always used to mark the end of a conversation she had decided was over, and turned her gaze to the window and the frozen park beyond it, and said nothing further. Eleanor thanked the dowager for the tea she had not been offered and followed Edmund out of the room. It was in the first week of March that Eleanor noticed the bud. She had gone to the kitchen garden in the late morning on one of those days when the library work had finished ahead of her expectations, leaving her with an hour belonging to no particular obligation. She stood in the southwest corner and looked at the rosebush with the attention she had been giving it since January, the particular attention one gives to something that has come to mean more than it strictly needs to, that one visits as one visits a friend, without accounting precisely for the frequency of the visits or justifying each one. The canes were unchanged from the last time she had looked, still bare and grey and patient, still carrying the careful geometry of Edmund's January pruning, each cane in its appointed position. But on one cane, the uppermost branch of the rightmost one, there was a bud. One bud. Small and very tight and deeply green, a compact point barely distinguishable from the bark itself if you were not looking for it, which she had been, which was why she saw it. She stood beside the rosebush for a minute or slightly more without moving, letting the fact of it settle, and then she went back to the house. The frost had been retreating for 3 days. It had not left in the dramatic fashion of a thaw, but in the quiet way that cold retreats when it simply runs out of the will to persist, a degree warmer each morning, the ground releasing its hardness in sections, the air losing its edge as though the decision to stay cold had been reconsidered and allowed to lapse without ceremony. The kitchen garden now carried the particular tentative quality of something just beginning to believe that the season has genuinely turned, not yet prepared to commit fully to the belief, still holding some reserve of winter caution in the frozen-edged corners where the old brick met the ground. Eleanor walked back through the iron gate and along the east path to the house, carrying the thought of the bud somewhere in her chest, with the careful attentiveness one gives to small, fragile, true things that one does not wish to drop by examining too directly. 2 days later, on a Monday morning, Edmund found her in the morning room. She had not been invited to take on the household accounts. She had simply found them, in a leather box on the shelf in the writing room adjacent to the library, 3 seasons' worth of household expenditure and staff wages and coal deliveries and tradesmen's quarterly bills, in a state of accumulated disorder that offended her sense of what any set of accounts was owed from those who kept them. And she had spent the preceding 3 evenings reorganizing everything into a clean ledger in the careful hand she had developed over 4 years of managing her own reduced but carefully tended finances. She had told no one she was doing it. She had done it because it needed doing, and she was the person who had noticed that it needed doing and possessed the capacity to address it, and these 3 facts together seemed to her a sufficient warrant. Edmund came in and stood in the doorway in his particular way, and he looked at the accounts spread over the morning room table, and at her, and at the accounts again. She explained what she had done briefly, and without apology. He listened with the quality of complete attention she had come to know in him over 8 weeks of shared mornings. He turned the pages of the reorganized ledger slowly, reading several entries, and she saw in his face an expression she recognized, quieter than it had been in the portrait gallery, more considered, the expression of a man recognizing something he had perhaps not entirely understood he was looking for until he found it already accomplished, already there. He closed the ledger. He said he had a question for her, if she was willing to hear it. She set down her pen. She folded her hands. She waited, with the quality of waiting that belongs to people who have learned to give important moments the space they need rather than hurrying them toward conclusion. He said he wondered if she would consent to remain at Ashvale on a more permanent basis, in a capacity, he said, that would require a ceremony and the formal approbation of the church and certain arrangements between households that he thought, given everything that had passed between them and everything that was still being understood, she might not find unreasonable. He said it with the exact, careful precision with which he said everything, choosing each word before he placed it. And in the choosing, there was something she had learned over 8 weeks to read as the nearest expression of warmth he possessed, a tenderness that lived in exactitude, in the refusal to be careless with a thing that mattered. She did not answer immediately. She looked out the morning room window at the south lawn, where the last grey patches of frost were releasing themselves into the softening ground, and at the kitchen garden wall beyond it, and at the sky above that, which was, for the first time since the 14th of January, doing something that could cautiously be described as pale blue, not the white of winter or the grey of overcast, but a genuine, tentative, considered blue that had decided to be itself. She let the question breathe. Then she turned back to him and said, "Yes." Edmund looked at her with an expression she had not seen before and could not have described to anyone, and thought perhaps that was as it should be, that some expressions belong only to the person who occasions them. He said he would speak to his man of business that afternoon. She said she would finish the accounts this morning. He nodded once with the brevity of a man for whom a nod is complete communication, and went. Eleanor picked up her pen. The fire had been burning since 7 o'clock, and the morning room was thoroughly warm, and she was aware of the warmth in the way one becomes aware of it after a long time of cold. Not quite a surprise, but more welcome than one had remembered warmth could be.